Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. This is a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeology in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University. My co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, is on assignment and is in the Middle East as we are taping. Our guest, I'm going to change that word. Our ongoing conversation partner. In fact, I don't think you've missed but one or two of all of these that we've done as we've been working our way through the Bible. I think you've been here for
been a pretty long run.
Pretty much all of them.
So far.
Dr. Kent Bramlett, who is in the HMS Richards Divinity School at La Sierra, and is an associate professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity, and has recently been appointed as the chair of the Department of Biblical Studies and Archaeology. You have your hands full and lots of things to do. Not to say anything about the archaeological excavations we do and the program here that we tape, so we're keeping you busy. So.
Yep, it's like I said, hands full.
It is.
Sometimes in a very literal sense out in the excavations.
That's a good term to keep in mind for excavation.
Yep.
Keep your hands full. It's a good idea. We are moving to the book of Nehemiah. Mm-hmm. Good vibes? Does it give you negative vibes? We've walked through a lot of biblical books. What about the book of Nehemiah? Well,
it is a bit of an adventure. I mean, there's Nehemiah coming along and riding around the city walls at nighttime, doing a reconnaissance of the city. Why opposition? Why the opposition? I mean, it has all of the setup for this great sort of narrative development. And I think it's very illustrative of what's happening in this remote province, really, of the Persian Empire at that time, practically on the Mediterranean coast. Why is it an issue to be building the walls, you know, and why this opposition? And then, of course, the development in the book, Nehemiah's concerns about proper Jewish behavior, about preservation of the identity of the Jewish people. Right. This all ties into it, as it did with Ezra.
In fact, I think in the Hebrew Bible, we have them as one book.
Mm-hmm. We split them, I think, in this
that's
Greek
right.
version
and if you want the
English.
22 to come out right, you combine them. But I think they were held originally together. Mm-hmm. And so we have similar kinds of concerns, similar issues, a similar context. We're talking middle of the, 5th century, so we're talking the 400s. And we have issues to deal with for people who have, some of who've been living and stayed in what now has become Yahud, Judah, has become that province, and people who are returning. And that sets up conflicts with neighboring individuals. And Nehemiah pulls all of those together.
He really does.
If conflict is important for dramatic development, we have it in Nehemiah. In fact, it's really, I think, interesting to watch how this develops and to watch how they're playing foils against each other, and in the process they're looking for authorities, Persian authorities, to kind of set the record straight. And so people have to wait for the final word, but people don't wait until the final word. So I mean, it's just an interesting.
They take matters into their own hands.
They do.
And the whole idea of archives and looking back in the records. Right. I mean, this is now an established administration, a bureaucracy. I guess historians of sort of economies like to look at that and see the development of the Persians, which will, I think, come to full fruit with Esther when we talk about the role of law versus sort of the personality of the leader. Right. Before we turn directly to that, we do have some artifacts in front of us, Kent. We do.
Talk to us about these. What do we have? Household, elite, ceramic. What do we have?
I see change. I see change developing from the time of the kingdom of Israel and Judah. The Persian period is not probably as well known to the majority of historians and archaeologists as would be, say, the time of the Israelite kings. I don't know, there's something sort of tail end to it.
And it takes us into the time between the Testaments.
Right.
And people, I think Christians, by and large, are not much interested in
They're just ready to move on to the next.
But I would argue that knowing the events and the history and the literature of the time between the Testaments helps us make a lot more sense of several passages in the New Testament. So I would encourage people to pursue that.
Exactly, and I think that that's one of the important reasons for us to be sharing about it today. In the pottery, again, I see a development from the Iron Age traditions to what becomes the classical or the Hellenistic, the Greek and the Roman style of pottery. Ribbing, fine ribbing, so very narrow lines, bands going around vessels is very typical, really from the late Hellenistic and Hellenistic on through the Christian period, the Byzantine period. And many other things change. The handle, they have smoothed the handle and you see sort of major planes to it. There's a flat areas on the handle. This is typical also of the classical period. The rim, again, it's a very angled, beveled rim. All of these show, again, the developments, the influences of really the Greek styles. And it's happening before Alexander comes.
So we're actually talking about 1,000 years. If we think about the end of the Persian into Byzantine or Christian in the 6th, 7th centuries.
Until the Islamic shift of dominant cultures then brings a whole new set of ideas. Well, eventually glazes from China and all completely different technologies.
So what kinds of vessels do we have then?
Well, there's two broad categories. Open vessels are usually for serving. A vessel like this is relatively open, wide mouth on it. It's going to be used for pouring liquids, at meal times. Closed vessels that have very small openings, for instance, like this one, are going to be used more for storing. So we have serving and storing vessels. In the storing vessels, again, the smallness or the fineness of the vessel would probably indicate something about the value. So when you have very small vessels like this, or even like those over there, think of perfumed oils, think of expensive, maybe even spices. We know that by the Roman times they're bringing cinnamon. Cinnamon is coming in all the way from, well, what's now Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies. But this is long before that. So all of these things are part of the spread that we see before us.
And typical domestic household, nothing particularly standing out as elite or as wealthy?
It's pretty accessible. I would say most of the vessels here would indicate sort of a middle income, average home.
Well, then let's take a look with these contemporary vessels in mind. Let's take a look at the book of Nehemiah. And first of all, the outline, and then I will have you do your map thing.
Sure.
With where we are located geographically. But the literary context, the book of Nehemiah itself, starts out with Nehemiah returning from Persia with support. I mean, this goes back to Cyrus, giving support for the return and the reconstruction of destroyed parts of cities and especially temples.
And he's a high official too. This is not just
he is
random individual.
And then the story of the night reconnaissance ride to see what's broken down of the wall, so that the enemies around, the locals, wouldn't see
They would be suspicious of this individual from the king's own household coming.
And so checking that out, and then of course finding the breaks in the walls and the gateways and so on. There's a lot about a census here. It'd be nice if we had more archaeological evidence for some of the names that we have here. But there are lots of people involved here. Then we have theological issues, some calls for renewed commitments, especially to law and to worship. And then the ongoing problems that Ezra talks about. Ezra talks about falling apart when hearing about the foreign marriages to foreign people, and pulling out his hair. Nehemiah also falls apart, but he starts pulling other people's hair. I mean, this is a serious thing for them, but it also points on the scale of being inclusive and exclusive over on the right side. I mean, how do we avoid going into the exile again? We exclude everything foreign, and
you protect your identity.
And you protect your identity. You build your castle. Over here, you're more inclusive and so on. And we have biblical voices on both sides of that. So, but Ezra and Nehemiah, we will say, belong on the side of making sure we stick to restraints, stick to law. And
they probably know something about assimilation. You know, having observed in the empire what happens to people when they live in these communities for a long time and they don't have a strong sense of identity that's protected. A few generations later, they don't exist.
Which is the reason, one of the greatest reasons that we have this voice. And I think this voice means something not just in the 5th century BC, but in all kinds of worship contexts where conversations about should we be more progressive, more inclusive, should we be more conservative, more protective, more exclusive. And if those debates are going on, that's probably healthy.
And this becomes very important in the later period, the Hellenistic period and the time of the Maccabees, to Hellenize or not to Hellenize, to assimilate to the Greek culture and yet still try to maintain Jewish identity, or to say no to any of that acculturation.
We're on a map.
Okay.
So talk to us about this, Kent.
Right. Well, we have the big map here of the Persian, Medo-Persian Empire. And if we start here in the east, we can see that we've come all the way to India. Really, the Indus River is flowing down through this area. Provinces of the east that we're not as familiar with on everyday terminology, Bactria, Arya, Parthia. The Parthians were still an important people in Roman times, sort of
would it be the remnants?
The remnants of
the Persians?
Yeah, right. And they're still fairly tribal too, the Parthians. But as we move further west through what is Mesopotamia, this of course was the heart of the Assyrian and the Babylonian empires. So we know quite a bit about it. Susa is really quite far west, isn't it? And this was the longtime capital of Elam and the Elamites, who pre-existed. They were the original peoples of Persia before the Persians invaded as a fairly tribal people, bringing the Indo-European language with them. Persian is related to English, German, Latin, and so forth. The Persian Empire pushed west, and you can see that it went all the way into Europe, what's now part of Greece, and around the Black Sea here. But of great importance to us are the provinces over here. We have the province of Yehud, between Egypt and the territory of Syria, this province beyond the river. Beyond what river? Well, that's very important. It's the bend, the great bend, the western bend of the Euphrates River, which is in modern Syria. It's near the border boundaries of Syria. But this whole area had been small Aramean kingdoms contemporary with Israel and Judah. And when they were subsumed by the series of empires, Babylonian, and then the Persians, this became the province of beyond the river, coming down all the way to the small territory or province of Yehud.
And probably quite small. We shouldn't think of it as occupying all that is labeled there under Judea.
Yeah.
Fairly small, west side of the river, and not occupying a lot of...
including Samaria for the most part.
Right. So it's fairly small. And that probably makes sense historically, biblically, and archaeologically. We certainly don't have the remains to talk about anything much larger.
And that leads to tensions then as Judah, or Yehud, sort of builds itself back up. Well, what about the
neighbors?
The neighbors, what do they think? That's obviously a matter of concern.
Thank you, Kent. So, some archaeological issues and some artifacts and some people and some locations and so on. Coins. When do coins begin and where?
Well, it's interesting that coins, it's not really a very old idea. Sure, they weighed out silver, you know.
You can even read about shekels,
but it's a weight. It's a shekel weight, right, about half of an ounce. Coins were really invented by the Lydians. So that's what's now in sort of Western Turkey. And it was a kingdom of Lydia under the Persian Empire. But around 600, 500 BC is when the first coins were minted. And coins from Yehud, the province of Yehud, aren't even that old. They started maybe 400, a little bit earlier. But
we do have archaeological remains illustrating these coins.
We
at
do.
least as they've shown up first, as they've first shown up initially in Yahud. We also have some evidence for the perimeter wall repair.
We do have some evidence from excavations in Jerusalem. But again, the city has shrunk.
Yeah.
It's not as big as it was.
We'll see that in a minute in another graphic.
Right, and that's a sobering thought for these people coming back from exile. The stark realities. We can't build a big city. We'll just build a small territory, a small enclosed area.
It is not greater than we left. It is not more glorious than the one we left before. So that is a challenge. And then we'll talk about ethnic distinctions. Well, my question is, does the archaeological record provide any way to say, okay, this is a Jewish settlement, this is a Persian settlement, this is a Samaritan settlement? Can we do that?
You know, that's a very difficult thing. That's the old question, pots versus people, or pots and people. Can you identify a people group by their pottery or cultural remains? A qualified answer, sometimes, very, very carefully, sometimes. But oftentimes in border areas, they don't line up. If you do ethnographic studies where tribal identities overlap, the ceramic evidence, it's not always a clean line. And so at this time, probably not. Probably not. At least between Jews and people to the Samaritans, not. Maybe Ammonites, there are some traditions that we see that are stronger in Ammon, like this black burnish, in the cultural remains, certain types of burnishes on bowls. But again, there's overlap. So maybe if you have enough and a very strong representation or percentage, you might be able to say this seems to be Ammonite culture.
Right, right. Well, that's going to be something that we'll be thinking about because we are dealing with a lot of cross, at least tribal. We might expand that to national, but these are very small groups at this point, at least in the province beyond the river.
Yes.
So let's take a look at Jerusalem in the time of Nehemiah as compared with Hezekiah. What sorts of differences do we see, Ken?
Well, in the picture on the left, maybe I should point to it briefly, the original city of Jerusalem was this part here. This was David's city, and then Solomon expands it to the north where the temple was built. But it's not until, what, 300 years later, 250, 300 years later, that it expands. So this is in the 720s or so.
8th century, right.
8th century. That it expands across the valley here to the western hill and becomes a much larger city. But when
captivity happens.
Captivity happens, and when Nehemiah comes back, the reality is they can only wall in that core area. So this original ridge with the temple compound added.
And this wall was done by family groups, tribal groups?
That's an interesting story, how each family group was responsible for a section of rebuilding.
And did it in a space of 52 days, something like that. So this was not one of the fancy, well-designed walls. This was something that would at least keep people at bay if they decided to. I
imagine one could look at it and, oh yes, we know who built that. We know who built that section.
We know the family responsible for that section. A couple of other archaeological features that show up in the book of Nehemiah: wine presses and threshing floors. This is a picture of something you know.
Yeah, it's Site 84. This was it's a farmstead. It's not part of a city or a town, but there was a farmhouse or a farm building, and that seemed to have been sort of the administrative center for the fields around it.
Right. And then, lots of features, archaeological.
Many features.
Agricultural features,
wine presses, threshing floors.
Right. Stomping
basins.
The grapes in the left and letting the juice drip down this way, and then...
Settling basin.
Right.
Very nicely preserved one, that.
And then an artist's impression of a threshing floor. So we have plenty of these. We can talk about those. Inscriptions. What is this silver dish?
Well, this was an inscription that comes from the boundary of Egypt with the Sinai Peninsula, the Wadi Tumalat. That was this connection, a route that connected the two areas. And it seemed going way back into Egyptian history. This is where a lot of the Canaanite peoples, probably the Hebrew peoples, would have come through into Egypt. Probably the route of the Hebrews leaving Egypt as well, the Exodus. Tel Maskuta is likely the site of either Pithom or Sukkot. Right. And I think it's actually the latter, but this inscription that comes from that site mentions Geshem. And right off you think maybe it rings a bell, but it's one of the individuals which opposed Nehemiah's rebuilding of the city walls.
So who were those three?
Sanballat, he's called a Horonite.
Right.
But that's a little bit of a, what do we call, a little bit of a detour there.
But he's the Samaritan.
He's a Samaritan, but his sons have Yahwistic names, yes, so we know he's a worshiper. Right. And then there was Tobiah. He's called the Ammonite.
Also a Yahweh name.
But it's a Yahweh name. He's almost certainly of Jewish extraction. We know he is. Right. But he's living in Ammonite territory.
Right. And then? Geshem. So I've put in red, it's a little hard to see, I think, on a TV screen, but I've put in red the names that match what we have in Nehemiah. Elephantine, what is this place?
Well, far away in Egypt, way up a stream in southern Egypt, since the Nile flows north, is an island, and there was a Jewish community there. It was part of the, well, an exiled Jewish community for several centuries, right?
Right.
A number of letters come from the excavations there on Elephantine Island in Aramaic, and tell us quite a bit about not only the community there, but there's letters going back to Jerusalem that help us understand some of the politics of the province of Yehud at this time period.
Then I should say that I maybe should have had another category here, that a temple, because we have a temple. And we do have some similarities of belief, but we have, noticed the very bottom line here, and Anat Yahu. Is that Anat of Canaanite, of the Canaanite polytheism?
Well, it seems to be. So it takes us back to the reforms of Hezekiah, when it was a popular belief, apparently, that there was a goddess as well as God. So
we're going to look at some of the inscriptions. Now, this one is a general inscription, and it's about grain. Out of 175, some of these are at least more biblically connected than others, and this is one of them. So here we have the original text, and this is a temple reconstruction request, because the temple was destroyed by a person whose name we'll bump into here shortly, and there was the request for support, political support and financial support to rebuild the temple, and to do so they sent off these letters to Jerusalem. So we will see, and notice we have dates.
407, that's after the time of Nehemiah.
Right. So here is part of that letter. Kent, I want you to read this. We have another part to it coming.
To our Lord Bhagavahaya.
A Yahweh name.
It is, but it's got a sort of a root that looks very Iranian, Indo-Iranian, Persian.
True.
A governor of Judah from Yedaniah and the priests on Elephantine. Here's the quote. May Yahweh, creator of the heavens, bless our Lord forever, and grant you favor with King Darius, 1,000 times greater than now. May you have a long and healthy and happy life. During the month of June in 404 BC, the priests of Hanum issued an ultimatum. The temple of Yahweh on Elephantine must be destroyed.
So here's the bad news. What do we have in the request?
It has been 3 years since we sent this news to you, to Yehohanan, or
also,
Jonathan.
Perhaps Jonathan, the priest that's mentioned certainly in Zechariah.
Zechariah, yes. So. To the high priest, Jonathan, to the other priests in Jerusalem, to Avastana, brother of Anani, and to the other officials of Judah. We have received no reply. May a letter be sent from your hand which commissions the rebuilding of the temple of Yahweh on Elephantine. The details of these events have also been sent in a letter to Delaiah and Shalmaiah, sons of Sanballat, governor of Samaria.
Sanballat, but then the Yahwistic names of the sons.
So they're writing letters asking for permission both to Jerusalem and to Sanballat, who may be the builder of the Samaritan temple. At least some
which
have
is
suggested.
interesting on its own terms. We actually should have included that here. Well, it's actually more a little bit later, but we must get to that before we finish this series,
Right.
because it's an important contribution too. Here's another one from the same time, and this is now to the governor of Egypt. We won't take time to read the whole thing, but you'll notice the temple of Yahweh, creator of the heavens, was built and destroyed. We want permission to rebuild. And some Passover instructions. In fact, some scholars would say that this text has given instructions for people in the diaspora in terms of timing and when to celebrate the Passover. So people turn to this as an important source.
Important documents, yeah.
Yes, and it has the name Hananiah. One of Nehemiah's brothers is Hananiah. Not sure that that could be the same one, but some people try to make that connection. Yehud, we've talked about that, and the province beyond the river. I'm going to come back to this picture because now it's enlarged, and you see a number of the gates that are mentioned in the text in Nehemiah.
They've been identified.
That are identified and illustrated here. Some people we want to pay attention to. We'll go through these fairly quickly. Darius the Great, as represented graphically. Whether this is Darius or not, I don't know, but it is Persian treaty making with vassals and so on. And then a place of interest to us. Talk to us about this.
Well, Iraq el-Amir is the Arabic name for it. But this is really related to this family, the Tobiah family. Tobiah was what we know well from the historian Josephus, is of that famous family, Tobiah, the so-called Ammonite. But this is in the territory of Ammon. At one point, the family flees, one of the protagonists flee to the Ammonite territory, and they build this elaborate structure. It had pools around it, had sculptures, and it's a palace.
It had reflecting pools entirely around it. So. And called in Nehemiah, Al-Abd, well, not Al, but the Abd, the servant, and that's what its name is in Arabic today. So that kind of connection has stayed. One of the phrases has you'll have to decide if it's male because of the mane or female because it's suckling.
Right.
One will have to work on that. But I think the part I want to end with is this cave. We have more than one. What's the name on it?
Tobiah. It's in great Aramaic block letters, but again, clearly, unmistakably, the Yahwistic name, Tobiah.
Ammonite, but somehow Yahwistic. Somehow with, at least with his name and his tradition and his family and his roots, somehow Jewish. Yeah. Very interesting and an important figure in this time period. Thank you, Kent. And thank all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.